Hi, good morning. It's 1 after 11, so all of a sudden that attendee number is climbing a little more rapidly, which is great because we want to get started and take advantage of every minute we have together in this space. Let's just jump right in. Welcome, hello, partners, friends, allies in this work towards housing and racial justice through narrative shift strategy. I'm really honored to be able to welcome you to today's polling review as part of our Shift the Bay initiative, a coalition-driven effort to advance housing and racial justice in the Bay Area. Our research-driven and field practice strategies, tactics, and messages is offered through this initiative's work so that we can seize this moment to drive new narratives for our movement. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alina Harway. I'm the communications director at the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, also known as NPH, and really proud to serve in the anchor role for the Shift the Bay initiative. You can learn more about the initiative's work, resources, tools, and community at shiftthebay.org. Today's session is going to offer a presentation on our latest polling conducted by EMC Research to build on what we've learned since the start of this initiative, and then track year after year about what kinds of shifts we can start to see through our collaborative efforts. For years, our research had showed incredible high concern around affordable housing and homelessness, but it wasn't translating into policy change the way we want and need it to. While folks turn out to vote yes on affordable housing measures, sorry, my screen swapped there when Emily started sharing her screen, but great. Thank you for popping this up, Emily, for the project background and goals. What we were seeing is that folks were turning out to vote yes on affordable housing measures. So they were supporting in the big picture abstract. We were seeing them express high concern, but they weren't yet turning out in the same way to support the actual creation of affordable homes in their communities, or show up for tenant protections, or speak up for renters, not in the numbers or intensity we need and that this issue deserves. Our research last year helped us unpack why we're battling decades-old entrenched thinking shaped by harmful narratives of scarcity, individual responsibility, rugged individualism, fear of change. Our work requires us to unseat those narratives and seed new narratives around justice, shared community benefits, opportunity, and collective action. This research, field exploration, media analysis, community conversations helped us develop a pathway for that progress. The Seize the Narrative playbook gave us critical strategies, tactics, and messages to advance those new narratives based on the recognition that to really change the dominant narrative, we were going to have to truly understand and speak to the underlying values that folks hold dear. And that's where EMC's research picks back up to help us continue our learning, embed as we go, and explore the promise and possibilities of our narrative shift strategy and implementation. As we're about to get into Emily's presentation today, I want to invite you all here to deepen the impact of today's session by bringing practical curiosity to the information you're going to receive today. What does this mean realistically in your day-to-day work? What from today's presentation can give you what you need to help create these long-term narratives? You don't have to answer these questions alone. Today's session is certainly one opportunity. We're going to have a robust QA at the close of the presentation, but you can also support this curiosity through the resources and direct technical assistance provided at shiftthebay.org. If you go to shiftthebay.org, you'll find our playbook, our message guide, and other tools that will help you embed these learnings. You'll also find videos, trainings, and resources that can help you grow your capacity. And perhaps most importantly is the community connection available on the site. You can join our newsletter for a monthly curated compilation of tools, technical assistance, and application advice that's being made available to help you carry this work forward. You can also join our community Slack for real-time examples of our table's narrative campaigns, access to our initiative experts, and peer learning. You can also get to know our community today through this Zoom. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box. We've got dozens of organizers, comm staff, policy professionals, affordable housing developers. We want to know who you are and what's bringing you here today. During our session, you can use this chat box to share your reactions, your feedback, your ideas, and make those connections. Please make sure you're chatting all panelists and attendees, not just panelists. We want to see your comments, but we want everyone else to see them as well. And then if you have questions, when you have questions that you want addressed about the research that's being presented today, please use the QA box. That'll be the easiest way to make sure we see your question during the QA. And now let's get to it. I'm going to introduce Emily Kirby-Goodman from EMC Research to take things from here and dig into the polling presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. So happy to be with you. We have a crew, a bench of EMCers on the phone that includes myself, along with Ruth, Aisha, and Meredith from EMC. So feel free to chat and Q&A as the slides come up, and we'll do our best to kind of answer those in real time, but then we have some time reserved at the end to go through anything that we have missed, or just to pop it out to the broader discussion. So thank you, Alina, for queuing this up and kind of talking through the background and how we got to where we are today. Some of you all may have participated or joined the conversation around this time last year, when we were in what felt like a very different but yet the same place as we are today, when we went through kind of the first poll, values poll that we did in 2020. And so the research that we're going to show you here today includes a lot of the tracking questions, or the same questions we asked last year, and results, and seeing how things changed or didn't in the last year. So a quick note on methodology. We have a total of just over 1,300 interviews conducted in the 9-county Bay Area. As we look through the data, the margin of error on the charts and data that you'll see here today is just over 2.5 percentage points. We offered the survey in English, Spanish, and Chinese, and it was conducted completely online. So we emailed registered voters in the 9-county Bay Area a link to take the survey online, either on their phone or computer, or however they preferred to do so. And as I noted, we are comparing these results to the last survey that we did that matched the methodology here. That was back in May of 2020. So when we presented these results last year, we had a big caveat about kind of where things were in the pandemic. We've all lived through it. We know, or are in it rather, and we know where things stand today. But there's a little context point just to remember kind of the volatility of the environment for posterity, if nothing else. So a few quick findings overall before we get into the nitty-gritty of the numbers. So we see that kind of with the backdrop of the volatility of the pandemic and the economy and other things going on in the world, we see that voters in the Bay Area have kind of a heightened sense of pessimism. Homelessness remains the top of mind concern. Half of voters cite it as the most important problem, or one of the most important problems facing the Bay Area today. When it comes to the economy, we see that the perceptions of the economy have really improved substantially. So this time last year, we kind of had the 6 months backward, 6 months forward look at the economy, and things are looking a lot better today than they were in May of last year. And then with regards to people's personal housing situation, we see things are pretty consistent. About 70% report there has been no change in their personal housing security. 19% say that their situation is more unstable now than it was a year ago, which is pretty consistent with what we saw this time last year. On the housing value frames, which we're going to spend the bulk of today's presentation talking through, and we'll kind of get into kind of the mechanics of it, but just so that you all know for context, this was kind of a different kind of poll than you are used to seeing, and that we are kind of used to doing, where we have a traditional set of questions and we see how things move and all of that stuff. What we did in this poll, which built on the research that we did in similar fashion last year, was have a whole laundry list of opposing value statements. Some of those were directly about housing, some of them were about racial justice. And we essentially had two very extreme positions on either end. And we offered respondents the opportunity to essentially put themselves using a little ticker online. Are you on the far left of that extreme position or on the far right of that extreme position? And so what we're showing you here today is sort of where people fall within those two very opposing value frames, as we're calling them, and we'll share the language and everything. But the big picture takeaways on the value frames is that despite kind of the craziness of the last year, when we look at housing values, that is how people's perceptions about kind of those ingrained attitudes that they have about YIMBY versus NIMBY, or living near renters or homeowners, and all those things that we'll get into, things are very consistent with where they were last year. On housing, on racial justice, attitudes changed very little, which really underscores that it's very hard to shift attitudes. We know this, but seeing it in a quantitative fashion really drives that point home. However, we see kind of more Bay Area voters have more progressive stances than Bay Area voters that don't when it comes to housing and racial justice. Specifically, housing is a human right. They support building more housing in their neighborhood. This is a community responsibility, and so on. We see that people believe that housing policy can make a difference and people should have access to it and are perceptive to signs of racial inequality in their own communities. Where some of the value frames kind of lean toward the not so progressive end of the spectrum, we see that reparations is not a popular position. That was the case last year. We'll show you the numbers on that. A lot of people think that the Bay Area is too crowded and that people should have to live where they can afford. We're going to show you a lot of top line data. We have some subgroup data that we're going to go through just to show you kind of the 30,000 foot view on some of these big key populations. When we look at the subpopulations and how they may or may not have shifted from last year, because we're showing such little movement over time in the last year, we thought, well, maybe there's one particular subgroup or slice of the electorate that looks a little bit different this year than last. And the spoiler there is that there wasn't really any particular pocket of the 9-county Bay Area that shifted one way or the other. Everything was very consistent with last year. Lastly, we tested a series of policy statements or policy positions and some messaging, and we see that the policy positions were quite popular, specifically ones around the 3 Ps. And then on the messaging, there was sort of a lack of intensity, and we'll sort of show you that, but they were at least somewhat compelling to many folks. Okay, looking at the mood of the Bay Area over time, you can see the far right, we have today 42% of voters say that things are headed in the right direction compared to 44% who say that things are off on the wrong track. Things were looking pretty good in May of 2020, but also remember that was like, we have flattened the curve, the cases were very low, and a lot of life has been lived and lost in that last year. So it's not surprising that we see a little bit of jump in pessimism. And honestly, 2020 in that regard was sort of an outlier in the optimism, right? Because it was already sort of, we saw some crankiness and feelings of overcrowding and cost of living and homelessness kind of permeating earlier than 2020 or pre-pandemic times. In an open-ended question where respondents could offer multiple responses, up to 3 important problems facing the Bay Area today, we see that homelessness is volunteered or cited as the top of mind concern, with almost half, 49% of voters mentioning it as one of their 3 most important problems facing the Bay Area today. Affordable housing there, number 2 at 26%, and crime and guns coming up as number 3. And then you can sort of see traffic and congestion, cost of living, the environment, things like that noted here, but certainly homelessness is the top of mind concern. Looking at the economic indicators, we see that in the poll this year, we see that 35%, I'm looking at the graph on the left, 35% say that the economy is better than it was 6 months ago, 34% say that it's worse, and 30% say that it's about the same. Looking ahead to the economy 6 months from now, we see some positive outlook. So almost half saying that they expect the economy to be better in the next 6 months, though pretty soft. 33% say moderately better. A quarter of voters say worse, and then about a quarter say it's going to be the same. When we look at this and how it differs from last year, you can see in this top chunk of bars, the economy compared to 6 months ago. We said, okay, how is the economy now compared to 6 months ago? Back in May of 2020, we see that 3/4 of voters were saying it's worse than it was 6 months ago, which wasn't a huge surprise. But you can see the huge shift in the last year on how people perceive the economy looking back or reflecting on the last 6 months. And then we see a boost in optimism as we look forward. The economy, people are expecting it to improve or get better in the next 6 months. When it comes to the ease of finding housing, we see that there is a little bit of kind of redistribution here of how people perceive the ease of finding housing. So there's been a 10-point increase in the number of people who say that it's been harder to find housing compared to a year ago. So it's at 58% now. It was at 48% in May of last year. Though the percent of people who say that it's gotten easier to find housing has also doubled. So from 5% to 11%, and then the about the same has kind of shrunk in the middle. This is somewhat consistent with some of the other research that we've done, a little bit more on the harder to find, but generally speaking, not a huge shift. On the personal housing situation, we see identical numbers that we saw in May of 2020. So 70% of voters today say that it's about their personal housing situation is about the same as it was compared to a year ago. And then likewise, 19% say that it's less stable, 11% say that it's more stable, which was identical to the 2020 data. So I know there's been a lot of news out there about likelihood to move out of the Bay Area. Despite that, we don't see a huge change in how people feel about, their likelihood to move out in the next few years. We have 47% who agree with that statement that I'm likely to move out of the Bay Area in the next few years today. 41% disagree. It was 43 agree to 46 disagree last year. So not hugely different if you look kind of on the face of it, but the net shift, so the agree minus the disagree, has shifted 9 points in the likely to move out in the last year. Looking at concern about housing for self and others, we see very little change. People continue to feel very concerned about housing for low income and disadvantaged families, and less concerned about housing for themselves relatively, but still about half of voters in the Bay Area say that they agree that they're concerned about finding an affordable place to live for themselves. Okay, so moving into the value frames. So there's a lot of text here, but I'm going to walk through each one individually just so that we can kind of wrap our heads around what each of the value frames actually were that we tested. The number that you're seeing there in the middle is the average score, essentially. So respondents didn't see 0 to 100. We added that for the sake of analysis on the back end. We didn't want to introduce, what could be perceived as a grading scale to respondents when they saw. So what respondents saw when they took the survey was just two statements on two ends of the screen, and they could move their little bar to be anywhere they wanted within those two positions. And so the number that we're showing you is the average score between those two positions. A little bit counterintuitive, but kind of the more progressive attitudes we're showing actually on the right, and then the not so progressive attitudes we're showing on the left. So the blue just means it has an average score above 50. Red means it has an average score below 50, because we're using kind of the left and right indicators of those statements as being kind of majority above our position or below, or majority score. So this first one here, having a decent place to live is a privilege, not a right, compared to having a decent place to live is a basic human right. On that one, we see a score of 67. I support building more housing as long as it's not in my neighborhood versus I support building more housing even in my neighborhood. So kind of the YIMBY versus NIMBY. We see pretty progressive attitudes there, a score of just under 65. And then when it comes to housing, we should act as a community and make sure everyone has a roof over their head. Now I'm reading the one on the right, compared to when it comes to housing issues, we have to prioritize what's best for ourselves and our families. So a score above 50 here again at 60. And then housing policy can make a significant difference and help to control the cost of housing regardless of the economy, compared to housing policy can make little difference as the cost of housing is mainly tied to the economy. We see an average score of 58. So an average of folks putting themselves kind of around a 58. Like public education and healthcare, everyone should have access to housing versus everyone should work to secure housing that they can afford. The average score there is 56. I see signs of racial inequality in my community compared to I do not see signs of racial inequality in my community, a score of 56 as well. So you can see that things are starting to shrink more toward the middle, meaning attitudes are not as extreme. Housing policy should be focused on an area's future needs compared to housing policy should protect housing and home values for an area's existing residents, right smack in the middle there at 50. I prefer a mix of renters and homeowners in my neighborhood versus I prefer primarily homeowners in my neighborhood, again, right there in the middle, just below 50 at 49.7. Everyone should be able to live with where they want versus everyone should have to live where they can afford. We see an average score below 50 at 45. There's enough space in the Bay Area for everyone who wants to live here versus the Bay Area is too crowded. There's not enough space for people to continue to move here, an average score of just under 45. And then we need housing policy in the Bay Area that makes up for decades of unfair treatment of people of color, compared to we need housing policy that's fair for everyone today. Past discrimination against people of color should not affect how people are treated today. We see an average score of 42. So we'll go into these in a little bit more depth, but wanted to show you of the ones that we asked in last year's survey. We're showing those here. The average shift on the value statement, so the mean score that we're showing, was 1 point. So that is very, very little change in the last year on these value statements. They're ingrained. We know that they're very hard to shift, but it is important to know where the community stands or where 9-county Bay Area voters stand when it comes to these housing values. Where we saw the biggest movement, and it was only a couple percentage points, is that third one down. Housing policy can make a significant difference and help to control the cost of housing regardless of the economy. So kind of the economic housing value statement is a little bit closer to 50, or meaning less progressive than it was last year, but splitting hairs a bit because it was only 2.5 percentage points. And then everyone should have to live where they can afford. We saw a little bit of an increase. Likewise, the Bay Area is too crowded. There's not enough space for people to continue to move here. We saw a little bit of a decrease, but of course there was less traffic and it sort of felt like things weren't as crowded because there weren't as many people out and about. This is just a little key that we might flip back to a couple times because we shortened the value frames into these bolded statements when we showed them to you in future slides. For example, human right is our shorthand for that value statement that read, having a decent place to live is a basic human right. This is just a little key so that if we need to pop back and look at the full language, we have it there. What we're showing you here is each of those value statements in little histograms. And we thought that this was really just an interesting way to show you the data that we just did, essentially to say, okay, what looks like a half pipe? Where is the mountain, far over to the right? Where is the mountain far over to the left? Just to see where are kind of the more extreme attitudes, and where are, we seeing if the mountain is closer to the right, like it is on that human right one, we see there are a lot of folks who are falling into or distributed kind of closer to the housing, having a place to live as a basic human right compared to it being a privilege. So that's why we see on that first one, top left histogram, that the mountain is kind of far to the right. Whereas you look at, you know, access to housing, everyone should have access to housing. We see looks a little bit more like a half pipe. That's the second one down on the far left, just where some of the more extreme attitudes live, which ones have kind of different distributions of where the attitudes are, which is, you know, mostly just interesting, but not necessarily new data that we're showing you. And then we ran a correlation where we essentially crossed all of the value statements against each other to understand, you know, what's the relationship. And the takeaway here, if you don't or can't really see all of those little numbers in the graph, is that with all of these value statements, they are positively correlated with each other, which means we move value statement human right, we're going to move value statement mix of renters and owners in my neighborhood, or people should be able to live where they want, because those two value statements are relatively strongly positively correlated with each other. So if we move one statement, we're moving another, which is helpful to know as we think about how everything is so interconnected. So the next handful of slides, we're not going to go through every single detail here because it's a lot of numbers. So kind of pay attention to the blue and the red, and not so much the exact average. But what we're showing you here is each of those value statements by a kind of a long list of key subgroups within the 9-county Bay Area. So you'll see kind of the same suspects popping to the top in terms of where we see a higher average score that's closer to the progressive value statement, and the usual suspects in the red falling closer to the less progressive value statement. So on this first one here, human right, which is having a decent place to live as a basic human right, is closer to 100. We see that young women Democrats fall kind of in the more extreme, closer to 100 on that scale of 0 to 100, having a decent place to live as a basic human right. Urban renter women, which, you know, goes hand in hand with under 50 as well. Older Democratic women, we also see very high score, closer to 100 on having a decent place to live as a basic human right, with the exception of Republicans, men and women alike there, that are the two red at the bottom. We see a lot of the Bay Area falls above 50 in this kind of fundamental, having a decent place to live is a basic human right. On the YIMBY versus NIMBY, again, a lot of blue. The urban renters, male and female, or men and women, suburban renters, and then younger Democrats, both men and women, we see popping to the top as having you know, a higher score, closer to 100 on I support building more housing even in my neighborhood. So kind of more YIMBY attitudes. Republican women, they're the lone red folks at the bottom, are the only group that are below 50. On community responsibility, again, with the exception of Republicans, we see pretty progressive attitudes across the Bay Area that when it comes to housing, we should act as a community and make sure everyone has a roof over their head. Likewise, on the significance of housing policy, it can make a difference regardless of the economy. We see kind of the same folks coming to the top with the higher scores there, the young Democratic women and the urban renter women. And then like public education and healthcare, everyone should have access to housing. We start to see a little bit more of the red creeping in, Republicans, suburban male homeowners, but still the folks that we would expect to be at the top or have higher scores are there as well. I see signs of racial inequality in my community. We see kind of very similar with the most folks falling into the above 50 score, but some starting to fall below 50. Structural racism has directly contributed to our housing crisis. We start to see a little bit more red here, meaning more groupings falling below 50, but female Democrat under 50, still very high. Mean score for them are closer to 100. And then you start to see things, you know, the bars start shrinking because we see less extreme attitudes. So things are looking a lot closer to 50, meaning people put themselves closer to the middle of the road on these value statements. Housing policy should be focused on an area's future needs. And then I prefer a mix of renters and homeowners in my neighborhood. We see kind of closer to middle of the road, but a lot more groups kind of falling both above and below the overall average, which was right at 50 or just under 49.7. And then everyone should be able to live where they want versus everyone should have to live where they can afford. And this is where we start to see most groupings falling into the everyone should have to live where they can afford, with the exception now, you know, the young Democratic women are the exception to that. The Bay Area is too crowded. A lot of people think this, again, with the exception of renters, specifically male renters, younger male renters. They're the only folks that are above 50 on this. Everybody else is below 50. On reparations, we see, with the exception of Democratic women, specifically young Democratic women, we see a lot of red. Republicans have very extreme scores on the other side, so closer to zero. Their mean score was only in the, you know, low teens. Okay, so that's all the subgroup findings, and happy to answer specific questions. We didn't show a lot of detail on geography specifically. You might have some specifics about that. We did that on purpose because of the sample size. We weren't able to show each 9 county on its own, and we didn't just want to show the big ones. So if you have specifics about that, the EMC team is happy to answer questions on that. But looking quickly at the policy support for the various proposals that we tested, we asked it was a scale of 1 to 7. 7 is strongly supportive of that policy proposal. So what we're showing you here is the strong support, which is the dark blue. The light blue, if they gave it a 5 or a 6, so they're at least somewhat supportive. And then over there on the far right is the total support. So we can see kind of the big picture 3 Ps type policy proposals, making sure that current affordable housing continues to stay affordable to those who need it. So the preservation idea, very popular, 3/4 of voters are supportive of that. Renter protections, tenant and low-income communities, protecting them from unjust evictions and limiting annual rent increases, also very popular. Building more housing throughout the Bay Area, production, 66% of voters are supportive of that. And then we kind of get into a little bit more of the technical stuff, allowing local governments to approve building taller, denser buildings near job centers, transit, and existing urbanized areas. We see pretty high support for that, as well as, you know, streamlining, make it easier to and faster to build housing in all income levels. We asked even more policy proposals here, and you know, everything was quite popular. We're showing them ranked by what was the most popular. So if you're kind of looking at them stacked against each other, it looks like, you know, some are less exciting or supportive than others. But that's not to say that they're not kind of on their own or depending on the community, you know, supported by a particular pocket of the electorate. So on the whole, most of the policy proposals that we tested were supported by at least or close to a majority of voters throughout the Bay Area. On the messaging, we only really had one that popped on the overall. 75% thought that it was compelling to say, we all want a stable place to call home, invested in the future of our communities. We can come up with policies that benefit renters and homeowners. That had very widespread appeal. But the intensity on that one and all of these, frankly, was not super strong. We sort of know that, right? We know that attitudes are very hard to shift. So therefore, it's not super surprising to us that, you know, some of these messages wouldn't just like knock everybody's socks off, right? Because they're kind of where they are. That's not to say that we should give up and not keep testing messages and find the nuggets and the things that we can say to folks that will appeal and move their attitudes, because that's why we're all here. So a few big picture kind of takeaways and recommendations and then we'll open it up and look through the questions. But we see that despite the volatility of last year, attitudes on housing and racial justice are pretty stable. We don't want you to be discouraged by the lack of immediate movement. Alina kind of described how the infrastructure, building capacity, resources, and ongoing research and all of the work that you are doing will continue to kind of bring this up to scale. And then knowledge is power, right? It's important for us to know where people are. And it's important to keep these attitudes in mind when we start to develop, communication and messaging plans. We know that values are ingrained and hard to move. So we have to expect that this is the long game, right? It's slow and it's driven by more than one single message or life event. Potential policies have widespread popularity. We showed you a lot of blue, a lot of support for the 3 Ps and other potential policy proposals. So this is really great and gives us really something to start to build on as we see, future initiatives playing out. So I'll stop there, and I see there's a lot of chat and Q&A, so we can open it up to that.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily. There were a lot of questions, and some of them were being answered in real time, and some sort of lead to additional conversation where we can get your input. But I'll just go ahead and put a call out to participants. If you have specific questions you haven't yet asked, please do put that in the Q&A box. And then we can use the chat box to continue to share reactions and feedback and make connections there. But the questions you want me to share with Emily, the QA box would be a great spot to put that so we can be sure to see it. Emily, to start, I want to talk about the geographical differences. Gabby from SV at Home asked about what kind of differences you saw from one county to the next. Are there lessons learned, high-level insights from that geographical perspective about where folks are? I guess, Gabby, you didn't specify if that was sort of on the values frame or on the messaging response or the policy support, but maybe Emily, you could speak briefly across those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I noted that we didn't share the individual county data. So if there's a particular pocket that you're interested in, holler and we can kind of give you numbers to back that up. Nothing really surprised us, both in terms of the value statements and the policies on the geographic areas, the places through the 9-county Bay Area that we would anticipate more progressive values. We saw them, right? San Francisco, Alameda, where we see some, opportunity housing kind of going on. We saw, that kind of pop in particular areas, but there were no, I guess, real big surprises when it came to the geographic differences in terms of the value statements or the policy statements or proposals.
Thanks, Emily. So there were a couple of questions about that open-ended slide when you ask respondents, what's your overall what are you most concerned about, or what are you most thinking about facing the Bay Area? And your team answered that. They answered the specific technical pieces here where people were trying to understand like how to read this slide, but it seems like there was a bigger picture question there, because what we're seeing is that people are deeply concerned. If you look at homelessness, housing crisis, if you add those 3 together, I mean, it's just through the roof. We can't seem to we don't need to get people more concerned about the issue. So where should we be focusing our efforts in terms of making change? What does the research suggest we can make change? As someone who's been tracking, testing messages, and partnering in this work for some time, where would you advise advocates to focus their efforts?
Well, I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? I don't know that I have a great answer for, the exact action item, but all the work that you all have done, even though the numbers say that attitudes haven't changed, bringing awareness and kind of putting homelessness cost of living, housing crisis top of mind. And the pandemic didn't really change that, if only it exacerbated it in many ways. So I would say, I don't know that there's one specific thing, right? I think there might be little opportunities here and there that come up in terms of, specific policies. But I think that as you start to think about communicating and, the language that you're using, it's important to know that, when you're talking about the broader electorate or the 9-county Bay Area, we've got some pretty surprising and ingrained attitudes when it comes to housing and racial justice. So that feels like a little bit of a weak answer, because I don't know exactly where we would even kind of say must focus here, because it's such a big umbrella, and you all have a lot of different priorities within the organizations that are all represented here on this call. But you're totally right. We don't need to educate people that homelessness is a problem. Homelessness specifically, and I know that in many ways I'm preaching to the choir here, is a very complex topic, right? It's, in many cases, folks don't necessarily say housing equals homelessness, but in some cases, that's kind of a need, but it's more, okay, complex. We need supportive services and things like that. So I would say there's awareness, people are ready for something to happen. Exactly what, bite off a little piece.
That's great. Thank you. I also want to address something in the chat box. There was some really good dialogue about when you were doing your population segments that Black Americans were missing from the racial demographics that you were able to segment. And again, your team sort of spoke to the technical piece of this question around when you do the voting population size to reflect, when you do your polling percentage to reflect the voting population size, the percentage of Black Bay Area residents is fairly small, and therefore the margin of error is large enough that you all don't segment that out, because it would be misleading information. But I really want to recognize the need for us to be collecting data in other ways, and recognize that this, sorry, this isn't a question for you, Emily, it's more of a comment I wanted to make sure we address. This poll is certainly one piece of our research program. In our focus groups that we did last year, we really had an opportunity to oversample our communities of color, and we seized that opportunity to use that as part of the research we were doing. That's not to say, we did it one time, we don't have to do it again, but I do want to recognize that the research program is all built on top of each of the pieces. So that helped shape out where we wanted to go next. And also to share that, we hear this feedback and think it's really good feedback, and definitely can think about, for our tracking polling ahead, over sampling populations so that we can make sure that we're getting into the population perspectives that we need to be having, especially as we're talking about housing justice and racial justice together. Okay, back to the questions for Emily, though. I didn't want to overlook the chat happening in the chat box on that topic. Okay, there's a question about sort of open space, scenic views, nature. This is sort of getting back to that geographical differences. Has the existing research indicated any differences in communities like Los Altos Hills, Portola Valley, Woodside, Saratoga, Los Gatos, when we're talking about things like that? I'm not sure if that was in this poll, sort of questions around that, but maybe from your existing research body.
Nothing in this particular research that we could point to beyond the most important problem and just interest in, climate change and the environment and things like that. If those particular parts of the Bay Area with more open space saw kind of higher concern for that, but as it relates to the values and the messaging and the policies, we did not go into that component of it.
Here's a specific question. We didn't poll this, but based on what we have here, Tim Frank wants to know, what if we just call exclusionary zoning racist? Like, what from the research, what do we know about calling a spade, saying exclusionary zoning is racist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we, don't have Bay Area wide research on this, but just speaking kind of anecdotally and very big picture, in other research that we have done in particular areas within the Bay Area, when we have introduced that idea, like exclusionary housing policies are racist, we saw some pushback. And this, I'm thinking specifically of some qualitative research that we did and sitting in focus groups. And we had, a message that basically said that as a reason to support changing, existing policies. And people pushed back and said, well, that's just redlining. No, that's not a thing. I mean, people were just completely clueless. So I think while it's very appealing to want to do that, we also have to acknowledge that in some parts of the Bay Area, there are just kind of the rejection of that premise. And as sort of heartbreaking as it is, it's important for us to acknowledge that those attitudes exist, and we have to find ways to poke holes in a way that will kind of meet people where they are with their existing values and their perceptions, even if they're, mind-blowing, frankly.
Yeah, and in the words of Anat Shanker, sometimes recognizing that where people are is terrible. And so really thinking about, how do we continue to do this work and message in a way that speaks truth and speaks to our goals and our mission, but then, knowing that where people are isn't where they have to stay. So it really is a balancing act there. There was a question in the chat box about population segments, and our playbook is organized around 3 different segments. We've got our base, and there's tactics and strategies and messages to really help mobilize and fire up the base. And then there's the middle, which Dr. Manuel calls not just the persuadables we normally call them, but the bystanders, because our research had suggested it's maybe they're not needing to be persuaded. Look, they care. If you look at the slide here, they're concerned, they care, but they need to be motivated to do something about it, to move from being a bystander to the base. And then there's, certainly a section in the playbook also about our opposition. That's less about thinking we're going to convince them, but more about how do we silence that? How do we grow the base and motivate the bystanders? And there was a question around how do we, based on all of the population segments that you presented here showing where people were on the values frames, how do you recommend identifying like where we can start looking for like, okay, this is who our base is, this is who our bystanders are?
Well, a couple of things on that. I would say it really depends on the thing, right? So if you're in one particular city within the Bay Area trying to pass a particular housing policy or get behind the council trying to do something, the demographic of interest might be different than what it looks like in a very broad, narrative change sense, right? So that's one answer to that. The other answer to that is something, more research is being done, and kind of we're continuing to explore ways that we can be creative about trying to identify pockets of the electorate and understand who our base is, who are the persuadables or whatever we want to call them. And that's ongoing and something that we hope to kind of share more about as things continue to unfold in that regard. But totally understand the need for kind of a target audience, depending on what the thing is, that audience is different.
So we have some information here that can help guide our work, and there's work in progress. I know some folks have been participating in the statewide CCI work where they've broken up some audience segments, and we can continue to learning and dig into the Bay Area populations as well. There was a question about wildfire danger, and I'm not sure whether that is something you can comment on based on the open-ended question here or from other research, but there's a question about whether the wildfire danger might be impacting attitudes about building housing.
Great question. We didn't cover it here beyond wildfires coming up as a most important problem. We didn't explore that connection about production specifically, but certainly interested in doing so when the opportunity comes.
I know we're coming up on the year anniversary of the all of the lightning fire, so I'm sure that's a topic near and dear to many folks' thoughts. Would also love to hear from folks who are participating, who are in the field having these conversations as well. You know, we're digging into the data and the research here with Emily, but you know, we'd love to hear your perspective as well on that question or any of the others we're talking about. What's it looking like in your work? Anna Cash wants to know if you can share more on the perceptions of reparations or what people express on that idea. Can you go a little bit deeper on those value statements?
Sure. And to contextualize that particular issue, we did ask about reparations last year and this year, but if you remembered or tracked, the date of last year's survey was sort of right around, you know, right after George Floyd had been murdered. It was sort of the beginning of the reckoning and, you know, the summer protests and things. We didn't really go into some of the racial justice value frames in the last survey, and that was something that we came out of that survey all saying, which was we need more on that, right? Because the timing of the last survey landed at such a unique place that we didn't really get into it in a way that we thought was appropriate and needed. So we did take that step in this current survey to dig into those attitudes a bit more. So that's why when we show you the tracking information, you know, we have new questions specifically around, you know, I see signs of racial inequality in my community. Structural racism has directly contributed to our housing crisis. Those were new questions that we added because we felt, you know, we didn't have enough or the right kinds of questions in the last survey. So on reparations specifically, the one that I'm looking at here is down at the bottom. In fact, maybe I'll pull up the other look at it so that it is a little bit easier to see. On this question, you know, if you look at the left, the statement on the left, we need housing policy that's fair for everyone today. Past discrimination against people of color should not affect how people are treated today. You could argue that the way that we worded that, we need housing policy that is fair for everyone today, that particular statement, just that one first sentence, is kind of hard to disagree with, right? So when we tried to put them in extremes, make up for decades of unfair treatment versus should not affect how people are treated today, by attempting to polarize those statements, we almost made it kind of hard to disagree or easy for people to put themselves into that camp. It was a little bit double-barreled in that way. And as we've thought about this and dug apart on this particular survey, we sort of thought, you know, maybe that particular statement, we need housing policy that's fair for everyone today, was a little bit of a primer for people to fall into that. So we wanted to keep the question the same so we could see how attitudes changed. And because they didn't, I think it's worth exploring that particular element and reparations meaning in more depth, because we may have worded the question in a way that kind of set us up for not truly understanding values on that particular issue. We don't want to ignore that more people are falling into under 50 score on this, but part of it might be that, part of it might be actual attitudes. So I think we need to explore more on that one.
It's so tricky though. I remember when we were designing this, I mean, we were also trying to avoid the Bradley effect. Like we know people have a hard time like copping to what they really feel and think. And so we wanted to really unearth the values. And seeing in the chat box too, like that is the language that they think that means fair.
Yep.
So it just goes to show how hard it is to really pull this, and why we do this in combination with focus groups and really rely on the field perspectives and the community conversations. We sort of need to have all those pieces together to really dig in on this. Yeah, and then the word reparations is loaded, someone comments, and we don't use that language in our poll, right? That's just how we're using it to describe to each
So
other, I mean.
correct. Reparations is our shorthand language. We did not use that. What you see in the little gray box on either end of the scale here, 0 and 100, that is the exact wording that respondents in the poll saw. We just shorthanded it to reparations.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. So there's okay, a couple more came in. I'm gonna look at those. I know we're coming up on noon, but there was one I wanted to just read out loud. Jose had asked earlier, have you seen increasing evidence that EMB is actually accelerating in the region through policy change or actual units being built? Or is the disconnect between what people are saying they want and actual actions the same kind of thing, what people say versus what they actually believe? Now, Ruth answered in the chat box, this survey doesn't show it because it's only a 1-year comparison, but in other research, we've seen some attitudinal shift over the past 5 or 6 years on reception to building more housing. So we think there's been some very long-term shift on that issue generally. However, there is also a disconnect between what people are saying generally and what they're open to in their own neighborhood. I just wanted to uplift that. I thought it was a great question in response, and ask Emily if you have anything you want to add to that or contextualize.
No, I totally agree with Ruth. I think she nailed that one.
Great. Okay, well, that lets us go back to the open questions here. I'm going to let some of the more technical ones, I'm hoping your team can keep hopping in there and answering some of those. The strong ambivalence and divide on housing policy planning for the future versus protecting homeowner value explains a lot of what we've been hearing from the community for the past year. Thanks for giving that a different context and how we can hear those comments. So there's not a question there, but maybe I can put that as a question back to the participants. It'd be really helpful to hear from you all in the chat box. What are you seeing and hearing in those community conversations on that, you know, what they say versus what they want, how they're describing in terms of like the now versus the future versus the past. Excessive rents and price gouging. Are there any conversations about rent caps and also the lack of availability for rents that match income and not only affordable housing? This sounds like a broader question around like what the policy support is on rental support. And I'm wondering if you could go back to the slides where you all looked at policy support for tenant protections and just walk through what do we know, what did we learn?
Yeah, I would say renter protections are popular. I think people sort of acknowledged, you know, during COVID, the moratorium on evictions and, you know, other things was very helpful because, you know, renters in particular, you know, were in a bad spot. So I think they're very popular. And when we talk specifically about, you know, limiting annual rent increases, protecting renters or tenants from unjust evictions, or when we also use the phrase unfair landlords, that also resonates pretty strongly as well. So I would say big picture, renter protections are very popular, especially right now.
Thank you so much, Emily. I know there's still some open questions in the QA. I have some new ones too after seeing this again. I'm always coming up with questions, and we're just at time now. So I know folks are going to have to hop to that next thing. What I really want to encourage folks to do though is go to shiftthebay.org. There's a lot of ways that you can continue to engage with the community there. You can join our Slack where you can continue to ask questions, and we can work with our initiative experts and researchers to get answers, and also create a space for peer learning and peer sharing, because there's so much we can learn from. This poll is one tool of many that's going to help us really understand where folks are right now, what the dominant narratives are, where their values are, and how we can be impactful. So with that, thank you so much, Emily, and to Ruth, and to Aisha, and to the whole EMC team. Thank you, participants. We're so grateful to you for joining us today and helping us in this work. And yeah, check out shiftthebay.org. I'll drop that in the chat box, and keep on learning with us. We're really looking forward to continuing the conversation. It's going to take our sustained work and really strategic work together to be able to advance housing and racial justice in the Bay Area at the scale, at the resonance that we need to support our work. And we're looking forward to doing that in partnership with all of you. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.